of the things I love about the UK retro computing community is just how giving they are. And case in point, this lovely Amiga 500 was recently sent to me by CRG Glenn. Although, in discussion with him this morning, it actually transpires that it came to him from Neil of NLK Media, so it's sort of a UK retro YouTuber hand-me-down at this point. Now, I'm a big fan of both of those channels, and I suspect you will be too, but if for some reason you're not, I'll have both their channels linked down below, and I highly recommend you check them out. If you like anything that I do, you'll love the things that they get up to as well. Anyway, I could talk about Glenn and Neil all day, but let's focus on this, what they've sent me. This is the Amiga 500, and it's a machine I never owned growing up. I've become more familiar with it in more recent times. And Glenn does assure me that this version works, although, yeah, it could do with a little bit of a cleanup. So that's what we're going to take care of in this video. And then we're going to look at some modern day upgrades that we can do that are not too invasive for anyone to deal with. Let's crack on.
So I suppose the first thing I should check is if this machine actually works. Slightly worryingly, there's a sticker from an auction house here that says, "Power's on but won't read," which is a bit of a worry. But Glenn assures me that's not the case, so I'm not sure if he or Neil have already worked on this machine to some degree. Glenn didn't provide me with a power supply to test with, but I do own a modern PSU that I bought for my Amiga 600, and that should work just fine. So we'll go ahead and connect this up and give it a quick test. For this initial test, I'll use the mono composite out to this little portable TV. Obviously, if all goes well, we'll be using this with RGB video output. But for now, a little grayscale didn't hurt anybody. Now, I wouldn't normally recommend blind testing any vintage electronics, but Glenn has assured me that he's shipped this in working order. So we're only really testing to see if there's been any sort of damage in transit. And yep, there we go. Our familiar Kickstart ROM screen prompting us to insert a floppy disk to boot from. Let's grab everyone's first Amiga game and see if the disk drive works. Okay, so it looks as though our system at least works to some degree. It boots, it reads disks, and it tries to load software from them. Brilliant. So what exactly shall we do with this machine? Well, first, it's definitely going to need a cleanup to remove the variety of stickers that a previous owner added. Clearly a fan of mid-90s edgy cartoons. There's also a fair amount of dirt and grime, particularly in some of the more hard-to-reach areas like these ventilation holes. And the whole thing could do with a retrobrite treatment as well to get it looking its best. I think then what I'd like to do is look into some quality of life improvements that make it much more usable in 2025. I do have a fully modded Amiga 600, so I don't want to go all out with this machine, but some largely external additions might well give us the sort of additional functionality we need to make this more enjoyable to use. And to do that, we'll be relying on the help of this video's sponsor, PCBWay.
I use PCBWay for all my PCB needs, and the service I've received has always been quick, cheap, and of a high quality. Simply upload your Gerber files and select the options that suit you, and PCBWay will give you an instant quote. They also have a fantastic project library, many of which include a bill of materials so that, if you want to, PCBWay can source the parts to construct the PCB for you. What's more, the project owners are paid a commission each time you order their design, so it's a great way to support independent creators. Order yours today at PCBWay.com.
So let's get this machine dismantled and have a quick look at the internals before we move on to getting the case cleaned up. The first thing you'll notice is clearly I'm not the first person to look inside here. All the warranty seal stickers have been bypassed, and there's some screws missing on the base that we'll need to replace later. But with the remaining screws removed, we're able to flip it back over and remove the top half of the case. And actually, it's not too bad in here. There's a few dust bunnies jumping about in the keyboard and a fair bit of rust on the RF shield, but it's certainly not bad and will just benefit from a quick cleanup. So next we'll get the keyboard cable disconnected and... Wait, what? Okay, I don't know what Glenn or Neil did to this thing, but I'm pretty sure the keyboard is supposed to be straight. There's a pretty obvious bend here in the keyboard frame that I'll need to try and bend back later, but hopefully it's just working just fine. To open the shield and get access to the system board itself, we just need to lift up these clips with a pry tool, and with it lifted out of the way, we can finally get access to our system board. Filth. Actually, it's not that bad. There's a fair amount of dust bunnies frolicking around near Denise, but other than that, it's not too bad at all. And there's no signs of any leaky caps, and no sign of corrosion to the board itself, which is welcome news. Now, we do have a revision 6A motherboard, which means we could happily upgrade the machine internally to 1 MB of RAM via the vacant spots on the system board. So we'll give that some thought as we go around upgrading this machine. Before we do any upgrading though, I'm desperate to get this machine fully dismantled so that I can give it a good clean. So next up we need to remove the floppy disk drive by first off removing the cables connected into the system board, and then by flipping the machine over and unscrewing it from the base itself. With that done, the drive lifts out, and we can then go ahead and remove the system board. Whenever you're ready, Matt. Okay, try the other side. Oh, Gordon Bennett, give it a bit of a wiggle. No, the other way. There you go. Inside the case, we have yet more dust bunnies. So yeah, it's definitely time we gave this a clean. First off, I had to get in there with a pry tool and try to remove those broken warranty stickers, as they're well past their useful life. I'll have a think about whether I try and replace these, as they're synonymous with machines of this era, and I do want to return this one to as near factory condition as possible. Next, all of the case parts need a going over. My go-to here is car shampoo in warm water, and a selection of nylon brushes to get the worst grime off without running too high a risk of damaging the plastics. The keycaps get a bath too, and then a scrub with a toothbrush while being filmed out of focus. Next, I turn my attention to the keyboard frame itself, and let's just say I'm far less worried about middle-aged hair loss now that I have enough spare hair lying around to fashion myself a wig if I ever need it. The worst of it came up with the help of some tweezers, and then it was in with an anti-static brush and a vacuum to get the rest of it squared away. After that, a spray with some IPA and a scrub with that brush, and we're looking a lot better. Back to the case now, and now it's clean we can see there's a few tougher marks on the plastic which a quick scrub hasn't removed. So we'll tackle those with some mild abrasive kitchen cleaner. My wife uses this to clean our porcelain sink, and it seems equally useful for removing light abrasions from ABS plastics. And with that, we're ready to retrobrite the case parts, which, when it came to editing, I realised was probably not appropriate for sharing, given how lax my health and safety seem to be here. So please forgive the pixelation, I just didn't want anyone to injure themselves by following my bad example. With that though, let's skip to the big reveal. So we have definitely raised the profile of this machine. I think this is probably my best attempt at retrobriting to date, and I'm really happy overall with how it's turned out. The only downside is that the RF shield, which is visible from the back, is still corroded in places. But short of re-electroplating, there's not much we can do, and as it's hidden at the back of the machine, I'm less concerned about it. So that's the first part of this video done. We're working, we look the part. Now it's time to start thinking about how we can make this machine a bit easier to use in modern times. Don't worry, not all these parts are going in today. It looks worse because I've ordered enough to do some group buys with members of the Retro Hardware Discord server, link in the description. You'll remember from the intro that I wanted to put in place upgrades that were relatively easy to achieve, and more importantly, I decided I didn't want any of the upgrades to require us to work on the system board itself. So everything we're going to look at today, with one small exception, is a modification that can be done without interfering with our 30-plus-year-old system board. We're going to start with the memory on this machine. The A500 comes with 512 kilobytes of RAM as standard, although, as you saw earlier, because we have a revision 6A board, we could solder in some extra memory chips and capacitors to give us a full 1 megabyte, which is a requirement for many later games. I don't want to interfere with this board though, so we're going to utilise a trapdoor expansion to get that extra RAM instead. You can pick up RAM expansion cards on most marketplaces and Amiga websites, but for fun, I've gone ahead and picked up a design from the PCBWay shared project library that seeks to replicate the original Amiga 501 RAM expansion board. It's a simple enough design. We've just got some RAM chips, some resistors, a few ceramic caps, a switch and an edge connector so that it can connect to the trapdoor expansion slot on the 500. It shouldn't take too long at all. I really like that the designer has put compatible RAM part numbers on the silk screen for this board. It made finding compatible chips on AliExpress really easy. Right, onto the build. Yeah, not a bad job that. Simple enough to make, and given I've used sockets, I can always swap out the RAM chips if they ever go bad. That just pops into the trapdoor slot. And we should now find that if we load a game that needs a full 1 megabyte of RAM, like Zool, that it should load and play just fine. Oh. Well, that's not good. So it turns out that sticker on the case we saw earlier may have been describing an intermittent fault. Now that the system has been reassembled, it doesn't seem to want to load any software. Not even our known working Lemmings disk that we showed working earlier. I swapped out the drive for a known working GoTech that I've successfully tested with my A600, and that doesn't work either. And what's interesting is that in both cases, there doesn't seem to be any disk activity. You would normally expect to see the stepper motor moving when the Amiga searches the disk. But in our case, even though the disk activity light briefly comes on the keyboard, we just don't get anywhere. After a little chat with some fellow enthusiasts on our Discord server, it came to light that the likely culprits are either some dodgy solder joints on the CIA sockets or floppy connector, or a bad contact on the CIA chips which control the floppy drive, or possibly Gary or Paula. To start with, I got the board back under the microscope to look at the solder joints on the floppy connector and CIA sockets, and although I couldn't see any obvious breaks, I took the opportunity to reflow those joints and add a little solder to each one. By the way, I should point out that the microscope I'm using is the Andenstar AD249S-M+, which Andenstar graciously sent to me free of charge in exchange for my honest views in this video. I've been in the market for a microscope in this style for a while, as up to now I've been using a cheaper USB microscope along with a 3D printed stand. I'm super impressed with the quality of this thing. The build quality is great, and although there is a little bit of a wobble in use, it doesn't really affect your ability to solder properly on it. You get a ton of accessories and mounting options to allow you to use helping hand crocodile clips, to have a convenient space to put surface mount components, and great options for mounting a solder spool and to have all your tools to hand, which is great if, like me, you have a tendency to attract clutter while you're working. In use, you get a variety of lenses included, with different magnification ranges and usable distances. Personally, I found this lens to be the most useful, as it enabled me to get right up close to SMD components without having to have the lens in my way, which made soldering an absolute breeze. And with this lens, you can drop it down so it's about 90mm from the subject and get some insane magnification going on to really zoom in and check on surface mount components. I found the picture quality to be excellent on the included screen, and the fact it can export video at 4K 25 frames per second means it's ideal for my use case of recording footage to include in my videos. It did take me a little bit of getting used to focus on the screen and not on the circuit board itself, but after a short while I found my brain had adjusted and it was no more difficult using this scope in this way compared to staring directly at the subject. The picture quality you're seeing here is direct capture onto the included microSD card, and I've done no editing on this clip, it's as it's recorded. At the price on Amazon today, I'm not sure I would invest this much in it, but if you look around on AliExpress, you'll find the same model from Andenstar's web store much cheaper. And if you can afford to wait a couple of weeks for it to ship direct from China, it's definitely worth it at that price, in my view. Anyway, apologies for this distraction, and back to the fault finding. So while I had the board under here, I noticed a couple of things that interested me. First, the audio jacks have been resoldered before, which isn't likely to be causing this problem, but it's evidence we're not the first people in here. And as I was here, I cranked up my iron to 420 degrees and eventually managed to get this ground plane joint to flow. I also noticed the tiniest of pieces of swarf under the board, which wasn't near any of the areas we're looking at, but obviously it shouldn't be here, so I went ahead and removed it. Unfortunately, none of this made a difference. So I took out the CIA chips and took a look at any corrosion that could be causing a bad contact. Both the chips themselves and the sockets showed some evidence of corrosion, which could lead to a bad electrical contact. So I gave everything a clean with some contact cleaner to make sure we didn't have a problem there. And still no improvement. So following CRG Glenn's advice, I swapped the CIA chips around to see if this changed the nature of the fault. And it didn't. Oh, this board is really starting to annoy me now. I had a quick look at the joints for the Gary and Paula chips, and they look just fine as well. But as with the CIA sockets, I gave them a reflow just to make sure, and I removed the chips from the sockets and gave them a good clean with some contact cleaner before putting them back. Still, no joy. So, after discussing with various people far cleverer than I came to the conclusion that either the CIAs, Gary, or Paula was not playing nicely, and the only way to fault find further is to start probing them with an oscilloscope to check if they're behaving correctly. Now, I fully intended to have this video complete in one sitting, but I need to order an oscilloscope and get to grips with using it before I can take this any further. So we're going to end this one here, and we'll pick up in a few weeks' time when I've managed to work out what on earth is going on with this board. If you've got any suggestions for things I might try to get this board working, I'd love to read about them. So drop a comment below and I'll be sure to get back to you. So that's all for this video. If you've enjoyed it, there is a button explicitly for that. And if you want to see more of this sort of content from me, you can subscribe via the button on screen now. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye bye.